As Prime Minister Mark Carney spent the last couple of days seeking to reassure First Nations leaders that his law to fast-track these major projects would not trample on their treaty rights or undermine the government's duty to consult.
Those aren't just words. This isn't an aspiration. This is the law. This is the law as it is written. The plan is embedded in the law itself.
And while some First Nations left the summit optimistic, others made it very clear they are not convinced. Take a listen to what one chief had to say.
This bill claims to include First Nations in a unified economy, but in reality, it undermines treaty and inherent rights by assimilating us into a system we did not create or consent to. That is not modernization. It is colonization in 2025.
Okay, we're going to start there with the Power Panel. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. Tim Powers has worked as a strategist for Conservative parties. And here with me in the studio, Carleen Varayan is a former Chief of Staff to Liberal cabinet ministers. Good to see you all. Nigan, what did you make of the comments there by Minister Gulmasti about Indigenous support at the table and the chances of a project going ahead? How do you interpret the standard, the bar she's setting there?
Well, my simple response is that there is a communications difference between Minister Gulmasti and the Prime Minister when it comes to how fast these projects or how the projects office will be set up by Labor Day. It is going to be impossible to try to get a series of agreements on First Nations, particularly after today's meeting, on even who will be the advisory council for that projects office. There is if there was anything that came out of today's meeting is that people's feet would be much deeper in the sand, because this was in many accounts, not all, but in many accounts, a real disaster of a first step for the Prime Minister to try to get this Bill C5 pushed through with First Nations. First Nations feel disenfranchised from the very beginning of the pushing through of this bill to the very nature of the law, which is that on one hand, the law is that the Constitution requires Indigenous peoples to be involved. But then, of course, the law, Bill C5, says that the cabinet gets to have a say in virtually everything involving what approves the bill. And then, of course, the idea that chiefs would come all the way to Ottawa for what it was generally an information session that was at times insulting really created a cacophony of a mess.
Yeah, Carleen, it's interesting. To this point, all the big gatherings Mark Carney has convened ended pretty happy. This one, I don't know if it's majority opinion or not, but there was a lot of frustration today. Some people felt disrespect. Some people walked out. What do you make of the outcome of this?
To be really blunt, David, I think that this two-day meeting was always an event that was destined to fail on some level, because it is a discussion about a piece of legislation that was drafted with what many of the groups in Ottawa today felt was not sufficient consultation and has already been passed. It is something that's taking place after the fact. So I don't think that it would have been reasonable to expect that we had a win for the Prime Minister and his team today. That being said, I do think that it could have been managed a lot better. It's never a good day for a government when you have nations and tribal councils and groups walking out and holding their own press conferences because they don't feel that they had the opportunity to be heard. One of the statements made by one of the chiefs that really stood out to me was when they said, "We are not stakeholders. We are not lobbyists." And I think that is something that the government and Canadians need to remember, is that these are nation-to-nation discussions, right? They're negotiations. Treaties are actual binding laws. So you can't approach an event like this like you would perhaps a Chamber of Commerce roundtable or a meeting with a group of industry stakeholders. And I wonder, without knowing a lot about, obviously, the advice the Prime Minister was getting, I have to wonder if perhaps that was one of the learnings from this, was that you can't just have a little event where everybody gets a chance to talk about their feelings a bit and then everything's going to go away. That when it comes to meaningful reconciliation and engaging with Indigenous people on major projects, that it takes a lot more than that, and that takes a lot more time than we have seen this move at so far.
Yeah, Tim, some of the things we heard, some of the chiefs said, they're sitting around tables filling out questionnaires and stuff. They compared it to being treated like you're in a high school seminar or something. And that's not the message you want coming out of this. So, I mean, what sort of a challenge do you think the Prime Minister is left with, the government is left with, as it wants to advance this agenda?
Well, I pick up on a word Carlene used, time and timing. Certainly, I am not Indigenous, but I've worked with a lot of Indigenous groups on development initiatives. And I know one of the things that Indigenous groups that I've worked with anyway place a lot of countenance in is trust building and the time that a partner or proposed partner looks to put in to build trust, mutual trust and benefit. I think that's the challenge the government is having here. They're going at such a pace, they're disregarding practices that have evolved over the last 25 years. So it's creating challenge. That's not to say, as we saw today, there are many Indigenous groups that also want to take part in development, want to take part in the opportunity. But I think they do and our nations, and they expect that the time and effort needs to be put in. And they do, I suspect, support accelerating projects, but it needs to be done in such a way that demonstrates an understanding of their history and their experiences. And if that is not adhered to, that's going to be a real problem for the government.
So, Nigan, help me on this, because, I look at what the Prime Minister says. And look, I know reassuring words and the long history of the country, it rings hollow, right? But he is saying, we will respect Section 35. We will consult. There is nothing that will stop us from doing this and living up to our constitutional and legal responsibilities. Indigenous partnership in some form is a core part of a project getting fast-tracked. And, he says they want to start with projects that have broad Indigenous support and has a chance to succeed. That, to me, sounds like a government with intentions that are not averse to the interests of the First Nations. Why is it so hard for people to accept it? Like, I don't, that's not a good phrasing. I don't mean to say, like, why can't you take the answer? Like, why is the skepticism there in the, with that reassurance? Why is it so strong?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Tim said just a minute ago, that trust is not something that's gained overnight. And certainly there are so many of us, and I will simply say that I did advise to say the government, this is not going to work the way that you think that it's going to work for all my contacts. What I said is that just by the mere nature of asking questions ahead of time, asking chiefs to come all the way to Ottawa where you're not going to them, even though you're promising a regional meeting, and then on top of that, only allowing one chief in the room. I think what was Carlene said just a minute ago is that tribal councils and so were invited. No, they weren't invited. Even hereditary chiefs weren't invited. It was only Indian Act chiefs. And so in many ways, people didn't feel represented even from their own constituencies. There are so many egregious little errors that were made in just the basic setup of this meeting. I do agree that it was destined to fail. Here's what you can do moving forward. What you do have is you do have a select group of chiefs across the country that are interested in fast-tracking development. We saw a number of them in Manitoba. Yep. We saw talked about in BC today. But here's the problem. The problem is that the divide and conquer tactics, which were created in many ways today by, for instance, holding chiefs up that were on stage that were talking pro-development, and there were a few also on stage that were talking against the bill. But that kind of setup of an oppositional kind of conflictual circumstance then spilled into the hallway, then led into a press conference. And that kind of conflict between chiefs that are for and against the bill will not create unanimity. What it will do is it will put people's feet deeper into the sand. And what you need is you need an egregious solution that will understand history, but then also show a lot of humility on the side of the government to listen to First Nations. The Prime Minister keeps saying that he's listening. The problem is I wonder who he's listening to. And is he listening to First Nations outside of his circle, which are those within the party? Is he listening to those who are really understanding of the intricacies of how to deal with chiefs? And I'm not talking about those always at the AFN. I'm talking about those who today said very loudly that there are circumstances that we will come on board, but we have to be able to be heard.
So help me just to follow up on this, Nigan. Is it they don't buy the reassurances from the Prime Minister? They don't like the text of the law? They don't like the way that it was rushed, in their view, pushed through, or is it a combination of all of them? Like what would be the biggest issue?
It's all of the above.
Okay.
But I would say, I would say that it is that we've got historical mistrust, which is always in the room. And so you cannot fix that in a one-day meeting, and you should just know better. You should just know that when you set a meeting up for one day for what is generally an information session in which there is information coming from the stage into the audience, that's not going to talk about all the intricacies that are important to be able to build trust. That's built with time, with food, with ceremony, with protocol. Many of the chiefs spoke about today the lack of protocol or the understanding of what protocol means. To work with 600 different First Nations ain't easy, but I can tell you that the first step is you go to their home instead of expecting them to come to your home, which is, if anything, I'll say the word colonial at the very best of times. So,
Carlene, you look at this, you look at the historical context, you look at the challenges. There is an enormous potential for fractures and fault lines here if this is not managed well. I mean, what do the next steps need to be? Because, of all the chiefs who are there are some who are probably totally okay with this, but there are some who they left there less comforted than they came in.
I think it would be wrong to take away from today's events a notion that the Prime Minister is on one side of the question of development and major projects, and Indigenous peoples, First Nations are on the other side. That's not accurate at all. But what is true, I think, is that First Nations fought very hard for a long time for the right to the duty to consult. And that matters. And that matters both on paper in a pro forma way and in terms of the way that you make people feel when you are in a room with them. Tim spoke about trust. Nigan spoke about trust. I think that's what this comes down to. We have a new Prime Minister. He does not automatically inherit whatever trust may have been built up by the work that Justin Trudeau did. Certainly, he didn't have a perfect relationship with Indigenous peoples, but it was an area that he put a lot of passion and effort into. That doesn't automatically transfer. So perhaps a learning, I think, for the new government is to understand that you have to build that from the ground up. What I think will be one of the immediate political challenges for the PM and his team is to go from thinking back to just May, although it feels like a lifetime ago, this phrasing of we are going to have to do things previously thought impossible at speeds previously thought unimaginable, to now having cabinet ministers tell us today that it's going to take a very long time for projects to even be identified. Being able to square that circle, I think, is the immediate challenge for the government, and that's probably what the PM will be pressed on in the days to come.
Right. So Tim, if you're advising the government, I mean, this, I don't want to say today was a failure, but it wasn't a resounding success, right? There are people coming out of here not happy with where things stand. What's the next step you think that the Carney government needs to take to make sure this important constituency isn't alienated in a significant way?
Do the work building that trust. Maybe you send not just the Indigenous Affairs Minister, but Minister Hodgson, who is so central to this. Send somebody who is central to the Prime Minister. Indigenous leaders, like any other leaders, expect that they get a true representation. Somebody who really is going to put the time and the effort in. Who is this government's Mark Miller, if you will?
I was going to say Mark Miller.
Yeah, well, I guess. Yeah,
like, where's Mark Miller?
He's available. I just don't know if he's the guy.
Mark Miller, but it has to be somebody who Indigenous leaders feel is credible, can be trusted, is connected to the Prime Minister, and legitimately represents an avenue to confer with and can communicate with the Prime Minister. Because if it's just symbolism, Nigan's point's really important one. In any relationship, it's how you interact. And for many Indigenous peoples, as Nigan rightly said, you've got to go to their place, understand their history, follow their important ceremonies, and do a bit of that work. You can go fast when you show that you're willing to learn quickly, too. So all of that may be a bit new for the Prime Minister. I don't know if he's had a whole history of exposure in that place in his previous roles, but he's going to have to learn in that regard.
So, Nigan, how do you reconcile the need to build these relationships and build this trust and the time that will take with the desire to move quickly, especially in the face of the constant volatility and disruption coming from the White House?
Absolutely. I will tell you this. I have never seen in my lifetime a greater number of First Nations, Inuit, Métis leadership who understands this is an unprecedented situation. And I've seen support, in many ways, a reconciliation with Canadian sovereignty, nationhood, even the flag over the past few months, because during the early stages of the Carney Prime Minister term, you saw First Nations very much on board, quite excited, in fact, to see a continuation, what was hoped to be a continuation of some of the progressive steps that Justin Trudeau had taken over the past 10 years. All of that goodwill is still there, even though it may not feel like that today. That goodwill is still very much interested and engaged in hearing the Prime Minister's words, because in many ways the Prime Minister speaks a good game when it comes to saying that Section 35, that's the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples and their rights in any projects, that will be considered, that will be included, that will be part of the law. He even said that today. And but then passing Bill C-5 just simply doesn't say the same thing, which is where the legal challenges that come out of Ontario, and there are more coming to those bills, will create more conflict. But that goodwill is still there. But it has to come with a great deal of humility. And what I would do right now is, if I was advising the Prime Minister, but you're not asking, but if you were asking, what would I give advice to the Prime Minister? I would say doing a cross-country tour, doing those regional meetings sooner, not later, focusing on First Nations, using terms rights holders, and specifically appearing not just to give information, but then also to spend time visiting with those leadership in those regional areas and spending time. And you might hear a lot about whether those regional projects have interest in areas that you might not have otherwise heard.
Okay. Look, we could keep going. We got to cut it short because the Minister of Indigenous Services, she's in the building. We want to get her into the studio and get her on the air so we can continue this conversation. But thank you all for being here. Nigan Sinclair, Tim Powers, and Carlene Verheyen, thank you so much. Prime Minister Mark Carney made his case for Bill C-5 to hundreds of First Nations chiefs today. Speaking at the First Nations Summit, the Prime Minister said the major projects bill will create economic growth for both Canada and First Nations communities.
With this legislation, the word nation carries more than one meaning. One of the points is that the economic value of these projects will be shared with First Nations as partners. You will help build the prosperity of your communities for generations to come.
I'm joined now by the Grand Chief of the Nishnawbe Aski Nation, Alvin Fiddler. Grand Chief, it's good to see you in person. Thanks for being here today, sir.
Thank you for inviting me to your show.
The last time we spoke, you promised fierce resistance to Ontario's Bill 5 and the federal government's C-5 legislation. Has anything changed in your view after today?
No. In fact, I think there will be an escalation of action on the ground. And today was a really good example. We had over 50 youth from NAN come to Ottawa today, and they marched from Parliament Hill to the site where the meeting was happening, and their message was pretty clear that we need to repeal Bill 5 and Bill C-5, and that they're here to defend their land and their territory, the rivers. In fact, one of the youth has been on the Ottawa-Upscott River for the last 28 days.
Let's set aside Bill 5 for one second, because that's Doug Ford, that's the Ontario government. Let's talk about C-5, which is what today was about. The Prime Minister, to an outsider, seemed to say all the right things. We'll respect the duty to consult. We'll respect treaty rights. Indigenous support and participation are core to any of these projects going ahead. Why has that not changed things? Explain to me why they're still down there.
Yeah, they also talked a lot about the duty to consult and accommodate. But the reality is none of those are reflected in a bill. Some of the wording is reflected in the preamble, which is not worth anything. But in terms of the actual legislation, none of that is in the bill. And that's why I think a number of our chiefs at the Assembly said that we don't trust what you're saying.
So it does say in Section 2, Clause C, of the legislation, Indigenous peoples whose rights recognized and affirmed by Section 35, who may be adversely affected by the carrying out of the project, must be consulted. So it does say there must be a consultation process. Tell me what's missing if that is in there.
To accommodate.
Right.
And to me, that's a big issue. I know you, in your previous interview just now, you asked the minister that very important question: what happens if a community says, "No, we are not ready"? And I think that's something that many of our leaders that came here today wanted to know, and the Prime Minister and the Minister sort of skirted around that very important question.
The message that I got from the Minister, and you can tell me if this is different than what was said in the media because we weren't allowed in, but her and the Prime Minister and others have said they don't want to start down the path of fast-tracking a project that doesn't already have some sort of consensus behind it. That these projects will go through the existing process as opposed to this special process. Is that consistent with your understanding of how they're planning to approach it, and does that give you any comfort?
Not really. And again, I'm just reflecting on what I heard today and what I've heard in the days and weeks previous to this gathering. Is that even though the Prime Minister is sort of saying the right things, that and also the ministers, when they talk about their duty to consult and accommodate, we don't trust what they're saying.
Is it them in
it's not,
particular, or is it history that has you not trusting them?
It's both. I think there's we've heard those words before, but in terms of the action, the follow through, we don't see it.
So how does this move forward, Grand Chief? Because if you don't trust them, that's different than disagreeing with them. You know what I mean? You can disagree, but
Yeah.
respect and trust. If it's a lack of trust, that's a bigger
It's hard to
problem.
build trust when even this gathering, it happens so quickly. 2 weeks, and we're and many of our chiefs and then are dealing with many emergencies, including forest fires and power outages, and they couldn't just pick up and come here. So I think even the way this meeting happened was very, very inappropriate. And what we're asking the Prime Minister, and what I'll be meeting with Minister Galmasti tomorrow, is that I'll be asking them to come to our territories and have this dialogue, that's based on trust and respect, or to try to rebuild that trust and that relationship that I mentioned a few weeks ago when I was here, that because of how quickly they moved with this bill, that whatever trust was there and the respect was gone. And so we need to rebuild that before we can even have a meaningful engagement and dialogue.
Right. So, I guess there's a difference between moving with urgency and then rushing. And you felt rushed, right? Like a lot of people felt that whatever the intention is here, the process was alienating and frustrating.
And we were left out. We were totally left out. I was here 2 weeks ago. We did a rally here. We submitted our names to the committees to be a witness on the hearings, and we were not even included in that process. And so, that's why we're here again today. I was a bit reluctant to come to this assembly, but we felt it was important for us to be here to tell Prime Minister Carney and his government that the lands that they're talking about, the resources, are ours, and we need to be at the table to dictate how resource development will happen in our respective territories.
So coming to your lands, coming to speak to your people directly is something you want to see, but the Prime Minister has talked about not really being willing to amend the legislation as it exists. So if the law won't change, and they can come and speak to you and your people, but what do you fundamentally need to hear and see before there can be trust? Because if this starts a process where trust fractures, it's going to be difficult to come back from.
Well, I mean, we'll see what happens after today. I think we look at today as just a beginning. We made it very clear that this was not consultation, that we need to develop a process where we create these forums and tables specific for Nishnawbe escalation, where we can have these meaningful discussions and dialogue with the government.
So do you think an environment, just as a final point, Grand Chief, exists where you can have that discussion and dialogue and work towards a good faith solution? Or do you think the outcome of today is the possibility of escalation and that fierce resistance you talked about last time we spoke?
Well, we will be inviting the Prime Minister and his ministers to come and sit with us in our territory, in our own tables. And I hope he accepts our invitation, because to me that is how we will rebuild that relationship, so that we can have these very meaningful discussions.
Have you made that invitation? Do you know yet if there's any indication of whether that will happen, or is this just maybe the first the Prime Minister's hearing about it?
Yeah, we will be. We just don't blurt out the invitation to come in. You know what I mean?
No, I hear you.
We work with our leadership to plan how this invitation will be sent and who will deliver it and how this meeting will happen.
Okay.
And we have yet to create that forum where that discussion will happen.
All right. Well, Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler, we appreciate you accepting our invitation to come in. It's good to see you in person, sir.
Thank
That's
you.
the Grand Chief of the Nishnawbe Aski Nation, Alvin Fiddler. Thank you, sir.